today, so hopefully you'll be able to understand me. I'll try not to sniff too much, but I can't promise anything. So, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kieran Hicks. I'm here today to present some work we conducted on design and movement-based play with young people using powered wheelchairs. I worked as an RA on this project, alongside with Kathrin, Kalyn, Adam Evans, and Conor Linehan. So, the motivation for our work was that young people with mobility impairments generally have limited opportunity to engage in physically stimulating play. If you think about playgrounds in your area or many sports facilities, while there has obviously been some improvements in the last few years, but especially in the UK, there are many places that remain inaccessible. And it makes it really hard for young people who do use powered wheelchairs to engage in playful physical activity. So, at the same time, we know from previous research that movement-based games are a good way of providing additional opportunities for physical activity and play, and they can be leveraged to engage diverse audiences. But we don't really know much about the potential for young people using powered wheelchairs. For example, how do games need to be designed to accommodate players who don't engage for the sake of physical exertion, but more for a physical experience? And what value movement-based play for young people who use powered wheelchairs? So, to answer these questions, we set out to work with St. Francis, which is a local school that provides education for young people with special needs. They cater to a range of ages and abilities, including different cognitive and mobility impairments. We worked with teenagers and young adults who use powered wheelchairs every day to try and figure out their thoughts on movement-based play and to design a set of movement-based games alongside them. So, our project was 3 main stages. First, we established a participatory design process at the school, during which we held a number of design sessions and invited young people to explore their opinions around games, movement, and perspectives on themselves. Second, we built on these results of these sessions to develop 3 movement-based, wheelchair-controlled games that would allow the participants to experience different forms of movement-based play. And finally, we brought the games back to the school players to test, and I'd like to talk about 4 case studies that we chose to illustrate the challenges and opportunities that come with movement-based play for young people who use powered wheelchairs. But first, let me tell you about the development process. So, during the participatory design process, we worked with 2 groups and a total of 9 young people between the ages of 13 and 22. All the participants used powered wheelchairs, and 6 participants also had cognitive or sensory impairments. Everyone had played video games before, and most of the groups were familiar with movement-based games, although usually not from personal experience. We designed a total of 4 themed sessions, each exploring a different theme around the games, powered wheelchairs and movement-based play, and over the 4 months we hosted a total of 9 sessions, including some repeat and catch-up sessions. So, the first session was to explore general design requirements and identify generally desirable game themes. So in the first session, we didn't want players to think too much about anything wheelchair-related, and so instead kept to general game-related discussion prompts. However, we quickly found that individual player abilities were closely tied in with the participants' experiences with the games. For example, one participant explained how playing games using traditional controllers took a lot of strength, and that she preferred using a head switch instead. In terms of preferences, one participant commented on restrictions that were imposed on them by their parents and by the staff at the school. So they went out to play gory games, for example. But then also pointed out that the shorter playing experiences were generally easier to engage with. When we asked them about game themes, sports-style games frequently came up, and a general discussion around mechanics showed a strong interest in competition, but some concerns around balancing if players did have different abilities. In the second session, we applied techniques from visual sociology to create drawings of the participants to explore how they viewed themselves and how they would like to be represented in games. What the implications for wheelchair-controlled play were. Perhaps most interestingly was participants were torn about the inclusion of disability in games. While they considered the wheelchairs as part of themselves, they expressed a desire for avatars that actually represented their personal situation, but they also expressed concerns and worries over how that could affect the avatars' in-game abilities. So in the third session, we introduced a stronger focus on game interaction to get some more insights into the requirements for movement-based play. We discussed different input options with the participants and found that some of them struggled with traditional game input devices, and everyone expressed a strong desire for interaction paradigms that facilitated their independence, and they want them to be easy to learn. So when discussing the wheelchair-based game input, participants were excited about an input option that wouldn't require much learning from them. One participant, in fact, pointed out they're already experts at driving wheelchairs, why can't they use that to play? So from these sessions, we derived a set of design considerations that are explained in more detail in the paper, but I'll give a quick overview. So for genres and themes, they wanted quick short play sessions that related to the real world. For game elements and features, we focused on empowering integration of representation of disabilities, and then for game controls, we had to kind of account for an extreme wide range of abilities based on the wheelchair control. So when we were building on these implications, along with the game themes proposed by the participants, we created 3 high-level game concepts and returned to St. Francis for further discussion. In the final session, we discussed a total of 6 game concepts together with the participants: a rock climbing game, boxing game, a Pac-Man clone, a skiing game, and a sensory experience without goals, but with rich auditory and visual feedback. And based on these participants' preferences, 3 game concepts were selected for development, which was a boxing game, a skiing game, and a sensory experience. So then we had to make the games. All games were made in Unity, and we used an extended version of Kinect Wheels to integrate wheelchair movement. We had to adapt the technology slightly to accommodate wheelchair users who have little or no control over their upper body movement. So a little video of the first game. It's called Speed Slope, and the game, basically the player controls a skier going down a slope, and the wheelchair controls for this game is turning left and right. It turns the avatar left or right in the game. It's slightly goal-orientated with the red rings that they can go through, but there's no penalty if they don't go through the rings. The second game we made was Rumble Robots, which is the boxing-style game that participants expressed interest in, where the player takes the role of a robot boxer, with the goal being to knock out the opposing robot. The controls were fairly similar in this game, with left and right corresponding to the robot punching left and right, and if the player moves backwards, it allows them to block the opposing robot's punches. And then the final game that we created was Rainbow Journey, which was the sensory experience game. So in this game, the avatar kind of moves around by itself, and then any input by the wheelchair user is translated into audio and visual feedback. So like orbs fly out in explosions, and the scenery changes color, and the music kind of changes tempo based on how much they're moving. So here you can see the implementation to how we tracked wheelchair movement. So where possible, we track the players just sitting in their wheelchair using the standard kind of Kinect skeleton. But then we used a marker-based approach for the children that didn't have upper body movement. That way we could make sure that everyone could play the games in the same way. So after the development phase, we returned back to St. Francis to explore the experience that young people using powered wheelchairs had when engaging with these games that we had made through these 3 case studies. We were interested in the accessibility of the games and how individual differences between players would affect the experience and potential value of movement-based play. In this presentation, I will focus on 2 of the case studies to illustrate some of our more important findings. So for the first case study, it explores Daniel's experience with our games. Daniel is 18 years old and has been using a powered wheelchair for 5 years following a severe traffic accident. He's an avid gamer and uses gaze control to communicate with people and technology. He uses a head switch to move his wheelchair, and as a result of technical limitations, he can't actually use the gaze control system and head switch at the same time, and needs help switching between the 2. So we first observed him play, and then talked about his experience with the games. What we found was that he could generally access all of the games, and the head switch actually introduced a small amount of lag into the play, which wasn't problematic for 2 of the games, in Rumble Robot and Rainbow Journey, but it made a massive difference in the avatar-controlled speed slope, suggesting that we don't just have to account for player abilities, but also the impact that assistive technology can have on the interaction process. Another aspect that was related to the impact of assistive technology, and mostly again its limitations, was that Daniel didn't just use the wheelchair to move around, or in our case control the games, but also to express his emotions. So because he needed help to switch between communication and steering mode, when he was happy about in-game events, he was smiling, you could tell he was happy and having a good time, but then he'd start moving around the wheelchair to express this, which the game would then read as like an input when he wasn't actually trying to like use it as a game input at that time, which made the game kind of confusing in some instances. So I guess that kind of, it's a valuable lesson in offering more flexible interaction paradigms in the games we made, and also kind of about the state of assistive technology and how it can affect its users. The second case study I was going to talk about is of Samuel and Matt. So Samuel and Matt are both 16 and 17 years old, and they have a neurodegenerative disease. So they don't just struggle with gross, but also fine motor movements. They both took part in the game design process, and they wanted to attend all of the gaming sessions together. So although our games don't support multiplayer at the minute, it was interesting for us because it gave us some insights into the social elements around play. Interestingly, while both of the guys really enjoyed playing the games, and particularly liked the wheelchair controls for their simplicity, they actually commented that not having to fiddle with the gamepad was really helpful. We also saw performance difference between the two developed fairly early into the sessions. At the end of the day, Matt had better wheelchair control than Samuel, possibly as a result of the further progression of Samuel's cerebral palsy. So although we would have expected they would be quite similar in their abilities, small differences slowly turned into much bigger differences in in-game performance, suggesting that game balance is really important in this setting. Another completely different aspect that came out of the work with Samuel and Matt was the their perspective on the assistive skier and speed slope. So while they were apprehensive during the design sessions of the inclusion of an assistive skiing device, both were very enthusiastic about the avatar, and upon seeing it, Samuel commented that the game was designed for people like us and it shows people like us. And that kind of underlines the importance of disability actually being represented in games. So where does this leave us? Well, the case studies of our games are generally accessible for players who use power wheelchairs and can contribute to the diversification of movement-based leisure activities for young people using powered wheelchairs. They also suggest that there's still a long way to go for some participants. We like to think that bringing ability-based design, as Rob Rock and colleagues' idea that it's essential to empower users by building what they're already good at, and bring that to games. And integrating wheelchairs into the interaction process could be one part of that. In terms of game accessibility, we feel that the most important outcome of this project is the idea of how it needs to be extended to include the game content and not just the game interaction, allowing individuals to find themselves in stories and showing empowering images of disability is something with a long history in other types of media that hasn't really made it to games, but could easily be accomplished through more diverse avatars and in-game characters. Another area of game accessibility that was touched upon in the context of our project were the guideline-based one-size-fits-all approaches. While we did our best to ensure that the games were suited for all players, our case studies also showed how difference in abilities requires further balancing, and understanding the rules of play can be challenging, particularly for players with cognitive impairments. This suggests that we need new design strategies to turn games into empowering experiences for these audiences. For example, something considered like a sandbox-style play could be like a valuable design opportunity, and that's something we'd very much like to explore in the future. So basically, what I'd like you to take away from this presentation is that movement-based games have the potential to open up new experiences for young people with mobility impairment. However, our findings also show that we need to explore game accessibility and move beyond interfaces and mechanics to understand how we can develop inclusive game content and then can provide compelling and empowering experiences for all. Before I finish, I'd like to thank our project partners, Charity Special Effect, and of course all the students and staff at St. Francis, because we couldn't have done the work without their support.